hour mark. So far, so fast. Dawn, Thursday. They've made it through the night and through early morning fog so thick they often couldn't see where they'd be the next second. The 24-hour challenge is almost through, and with every lap, the tension and excitement mounts. "9:30 a.m. They've done it. Proved that Kawasaki's new breed of high-performance touring bike can go farther, faster, longer than any other motorcycle in history. In all, 52 world and American performance records were set. But most important, an unparalleled standard of performance and engineering excellence was established. A Kawasaki standard which continues to set the pace for four-stroke engineering in the motorcycle industry today."
That was Kawasaki's own historical look at the Z1 20 years ago. Let's now come right up to date with a stock original Z1 in the hands of international road racer and broadcaster Keith Hewin, who has been road testing it on our behalf. Keith, what sort of handling experiences did you notice with the Z1?
I think experience really is the word to use, because the Z1, 20 years, it makes a lot of difference. From 1973 through to 1993, the Z1 doesn't really compete nowadays. But the one thing that, of course, it does do is emphasise the sheer power that the Z1 had in those days. Really, it must have been the motorcycle of the decade at that time.
Is there anything that sticks in your mind about road testing the bike?
Two things, I think. Handling is one of them. Sort of 100 miles an hour plus, it becomes a bit of a handful on a bumpy road. But brakes. Certainly brake development in 20 years has come on to a much more acceptable level, I think we can say.
But what about the bike itself? I mean, does it carry equipment that would be accepted on a road bike today?
Yeah, I think the level of equipment and the motorcycle generally was very, very modern in its day. I mean, and still stands up fairly well today. The electronics perhaps not quite so good, of course, the indicators not quite so bright, lights not quite so bright, but generally not bad at all.
Keith, let's have a look at the engine characteristics. Once we eventually linked the engine up to the dyno, we measured 70 brake horsepower at the rear wheel. Now, to me, that's not bad for a 20-year-old machine with nearly 40,000 miles on the clock, which Kawasaki claimed to produce 82 brake horsepower at 8,500 revs. How does that translate to you?
Very, very well indeed. A 20-year-old motorcycle, 1973 this thing was built, and really no drop-off in power much over the years. 70 at the back wheel compared with 82 at the crank is comparable. It's quite good indeed. I think the Kawasaki Z1 1973 version is brilliant.
On the original Kawasaki specification, Keith, they show us as being able to attain 133 miles per hour on this machine. Have you got any thoughts about that?
I've got plenty of thoughts about it. Most of them can't be recorded, of course, but 133 miles an hour, I wouldn't be surprised that this bike was capable of getting close to that. But for me, you'd need a very smooth, very straight road with a big braking distance.
Now, you're saying, is that because the handling is so bad?
The handling is not ideal. Of course, 133 miles an hour with a bike that handles like this would seem like 200 miles an hour on a modern-day motorcycle.
In your experience, you wouldn't like to ride this machine too fast, too frequently?
I think you've got to base it on the fact there were less cars around in those days. It was a much different situation on the road in those days, and I think that the bike nowadays perhaps is a little bit difficult in traffic and the like at that kind of speed. Not that you would be doing it, of course, officer.
Honest. Now, you also mentioned the brakes. Now, of course, you are aware that Kawasaki made an add-on brake package for this machine.
Well, yeah, I am aware of that, but of course it was a quarter of the price of the bike at that particular date that the bike was out. So, I mean, if you wanted to pay 25% of what you've just paid for the bike, then you could have a brake that stopped you a little bit better than the single disc that was on it already.
But, I mean, what is bad about the brakes? Do they just simply fade?
No, I don't. I just think that the performance of the brakes then, you didn't expect as much from brakes then as you do now. I think that we've come on a long, long way in materials that they make the brakes out of, and I just think that in those days, brakes were nowhere near as good as they are in 1993.
Okay, well, there's the mechanics of the machine. What about the bike itself? How about the style, the feel when you're on the machine?
The bike styling, I think, is faultless. I love the style of the Z1. 246 kilograms is what it weighs, 903 cc's. It's got it all, really. I think, as I said earlier, the bars are a little bit difficult to get around when you're doing over 100 miles an hour on the thing. But really, it's a great motorcycle and one that would be great in anybody's collection.
What do you think, any other points on the machine that, with hindsight, you would have designed differently? You mentioned the handlebars. Anything else that goes along with that?
Mirrors have got to be a major thing nowadays. Obviously, in 1973, there wasn't so many policemen about as there are now that's likely to catch you out on such a rapid motorcycle. And mirrors on this thing, over 10 miles an hour, you can't see behind you. They vibrate all over the place. That's no disrespect to the motor, that's just the design of the mirrors. Seating is a good two-up motorcycle, rides very, very well indeed. And the one thing that I really did like about it was the sound of the carburation. When you got this thing flat out, you really did know about it. The carburetors were telling you everything.
And collectability.
Absolutely a collector's piece. I mean, everyone should have one.
In its day, the Z1 Kawasaki was known to be a street and strip motorcycle. Now, Keith, your experiences have always been round corners. You've never fancied it in a straight line.
No, but Ray Debon, he did fancy it in a straight line, and the standing quarter claim from Kawasaki was 12.46 seconds. Ray, though, was restricted by the owner of this motorcycle and managed a 13-second run at some 92-mile-an-hour terminal, which I've got to say, again, for a 20-year-old motorcycle is pretty good.
Let's have a look at that then. Keith, let's now turn our attention to Kawasaki's modern-day counterpart, the ZR 1100 Zephyr. Now, the last 20 years, has it produced any real refinement in this bike?
Without a doubt. I mean, it's a lot more refined than the old Z1, but really, it's one of those motorcycles that does everything just that little bit better. But again, I always have difficulty with this type of motorcycle in wondering what it's all about. It's obviously not a sports bike, it's obviously not a touring motorcycle, it is literally a retro motorcycle with a medium range bit of grunt as far as the power is concerned.
Well, they claim 93 brake horsepower at 8,000 revs. We noticed on the dyno just a shade under 90 brake horsepower. That's not an awful lot of increase in power, bearing in mind the increase in size and modern technology.
Absolutely, and it is a little bit heavier than the Z1. They're both going through 5-speed gearboxes. But I've got to say that the Zephyr, in comparison, was a much easier, much nicer motorcycle to ride than the Z1. But you'd expect that after 20 years.
Handling, why easier with the handling?
Certainly, it's got a very low centre of gravity. The motorcycle really does handle very, very well on slow-speed corners. The problem you have with any retro motorcycle is being stuck right up there in the wind, of course. Once you get to anything like 80 or 90 miles an hour, it becomes very difficult to hang on to. And fatigue-wise, from a rider's point of view, it really is a 50-mile-an-hour motorbike.
What about the suspension? Has that been upgraded in accordance with modern-day motorcycles?
Well, again, I think yes, of course it has, and the situation is, again, in these circumstances, the forks, if anything, feel a little bit too soft for my liking. The damping at the rear, again, a bit too soft for my liking. Bumpy, fast corners, it's still not at home. It's got that retro feel about it, which, of course, I suppose Kawasaki have designed into it. Can
you lay the bike around a lot more than you could do the Z1?
Certainly I was a lot happier to do that because I was more in tune with Zephyr 93 than Z1 73. I'm sure someone that's used to riding the Z1 a lot more than me would do a lot more with it, but The Zephyr 93 bike is quite a nice bike to chuck into the turns. It does touch the ground relatively easy, again compared with the more usual sports bike. But it's a good bike at slow speed. Again, it's one of those things that if you're zapping about the country lanes, doing short 50-mile runs and the like, it's a very, very nice bike to ride.
Well, how about that question of brakes? How have they been improved?
Definitely been improved. The brakes at the front of the Zephyr are very, very good indeed. Again, the front forks, a little bit too soft for me. Got a lot of dive on the front end if you asked a lot from it early on. It's not the sort of bike that you're supposed to ask those kind of things from, but being in the position I've been in, I did want to see how it performed, and it done it reasonably well.
You say the position you were in. What about the riding position?
Riding position's very, very comfortable, but not at high speed, not comfortable at high speed. The seat was brilliant. The mirrors are also on this bike are a lot better than the old Z1, I have to say, and from a pillion point of view, the bike is an absolute dream.
How about smoothness? Does it compare? Is it similar to the Z1?
The motor is a lot quieter than the Z1, mainly from a carburation point of view. They've obviously improved airboxes and the like since those days. But again, it's a very smooth, torquey motorcycle low down.
Interestingly enough, do you think 20 years on from now, the Zephyr will have the same sort of collectability appeal as the Z1 has got now?
I personally don't believe so, because with one retro's enough. The Z1 was a classic. It was a front runner of its time, whereas the Zephyr is looking back at a front runner of 20 years ago.
Do you think it's got posing value, the Zephyr? Or would you rather be seen on a Z1 than a Zephyr?
Now you've got me completely. I think I wouldn't mind being seen on either of these bikes, but I probably personally would prefer to be on a sports bike.
Well, they do say that the early Z1 can be seen as an extension of someone's personality. Do you think it would extend your personality, or are you quite happy to stay as you are?
I think that every bike has its place. The Zephyr has a place in life. It is one of those things where I've always wondered why Harley-Davidsons make as many sales as they make, and I can see why the Zephyr makes the amount of sales that it makes. It is a nice bike to be around on. I like the bike, but again, it's going to be a matter of taste.
Okay. Well, with the Z1, we went onto the drag strip, and we're going to do exactly the same thing with the Zephyr. What sort of figures are we looking for with the Zephyr?
Well, Ray Debon, again, this time not under any restriction from our producer, he was able to really get stuck into this motorcycle, and he dug into the low 12s with 108 mile/h terminal speed, which perhaps for a modern day 1100 is a bit sluggish, but again, we've got to consider where this motorcycle is in the world.
Okay, let's see how Ray got on with his machine. The Z1 Kawasaki, Ray, why?
The looks, the engineering.
The engineering, it's 20 years old now. How has it stood up to the rigours of drag racing?
Very well. It's still the original gearbox.
After 20 years?
Oh, yes.
And no problems with that at all?
No.
Wow, that's phenomenal. Okay, let's move on to the bike, one of the bikes you have been road testing today, the original, the Z1 Kawasaki, far larger than your drag bike. How does that feel to you today?
It reiterates the performance. It's still very strong. It pulls well. The motor is still the main point of it.
Now, in its day, this is one of the class leaders. Today, how does it stand up against the latest bikes?
The motor still is very strong. Obviously, the suspension technology has improved with age, and the newer stuff is better.
Well, we're talking about the newer stuff, so let's move on to the second bike that you've been road testing for us, the Zephyr 1100. Up-to-date technology. How was it to ride?
It's very nice. It's very smooth. It's the sort of machine that you could ride either as a granddad or as a hooligan.
So summing up then, Z1 to Zephyr, Keith, in your view, which one would you rather end up with at the end of the day?
At the end of the day, if I was a collector, the Z1 definitely. The Kawasaki Zephyr I would use from a day-to-day basis. I think it's a day-to-day sort of motorcycle. So yes, I would ride the Zephyr day-to-day. The Z1 I would have parked up with lights on it, with the heating around it in my garage.